Hello, I'm Marie Dorini. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute for Ideas and Imagination. And we're here tonight to welcome the Institute's first science visitors, Jeff Schlegelmilch. And I'll tell you a bit about the new initiative. As you know, the Institute brings together academics from Columbia and artists from around the world. But it's not always easy to get scientists to come to the Institute because they have labs and they have research projects and they're involved in all sorts of things that require them to stay on site. So we've decided to host science visitors from Columbia throughout the year for short visits, and they come to Paris for a couple of weeks at a time and take part in the daily life of the Institute. They meet the fellows, they work with local colleagues, and they create ties in this way. And we couldn't have been more fortunate to start off with Jeff as our first science visitor, whose career and job description greatly broaden the reach of science. And we've talked a lot about that in the past week. Jeff is the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University's Earth Institute, where he oversees the operations and strategic planning for the center. An epidemiologist, he's an expert in public health preparedness, community resilience, and the integration of private and public sector capabilities. In other words, Jeff is the person who brings people and institutions together to get things done. He's advised leaders on preparedness systems and policies at all levels of government and is a frequent contributing expert to several publications from the Washington Post to The Hill. In addition to his master's degrees in policy management and business administration, he majored in theater in college. So how's that for a Renaissance man? Jeff is also the author, it's there too, of Rethinking Readiness. And I can't read the subtitle because it's too, sorry. So, Rethinking Readiness, a brief guide to 21st century mega disasters. So cheerful reading that you can find on Columbia University Press. And tonight's his lecture, COVID-19 and Beyond, Rethinking Readiness in the Face of the 21st Century. Jeff will give an overview of the dynamics of disaster, their impact across civil society, and how we become resilient and just in the face of future crises. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Really, it's been incredible being here this past week and a half and gone by really quick. I was talking earlier with Marie about how it's odd being a science fellow. I don't normally identify as a scientist, except in, for opportunities to come to Paris on a science visitation. But other than that, because so much of science is, as you mentioned, sort of built around this notion of the laboratory in a very reductionist approach, right? We take things and we deconstruct them into their component parts. Biology is made up of chemistry, which is made up of physics, which is ruled by mathematics. And it's a very deterministic view. And actually in one of our lunch conversations with Stuart, I know we talked a lot about determinism and chaos and optimism. So hopefully tonight I'll give you a little bit of determinism, a little bit of chaos, and a little bit of optimism. Not necessarily in that order. The other piece that I would say, though, is that, disaster science, and we're part of, within Columbia, the formation of the new climate school. And so climate science, very similarly, is this sort of new angle on science, where rather than reducing it down to its component parts, you're looking at the intersection of many different kinds of science. The closest analogy I can think of is like in music with harmonics, when you have two notes that are perfectly in tune, and then you hear a third note above that, is that we see these discoveries when we look at the built environment and how that overlays with the social environment. Similarly with climate change, there's just a lot of very chaotic systems in between the weather itself and the way that we build our societies. And so the climate school in being formed is really the next evolution of trying to indoctrinate this into academia. How do you take institutions that are built around this fundamental sort of reductionist approach and have a complementary sort of intersection of all of those different things? It sounds very beautiful and very elegant in rhetoric, but in terms of policies and procedures and tenure tracks and professors of practice and Columbia Senate and things like that, it actually becomes very messy very quickly. Chaos, not in the scientific sense. But that being said, it's a very bold experiment from Columbia, much like the Institute for Ideas and Imagination and the global centers, is to lean into that complexity, and through these conversations and through these shared experiences, viruses have a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here. I hope that I'm setting the bar manageably low for future science visitors, and have really had a blast so far. So, all right, I'm gonna do what everyone loves from academics. I'm gonna go through a whole bunch of PowerPoint slides. Along the way, please, if you have questions or disagreements or want to jump in, not a problem at all. Otherwise, we'll do some question and answer at the end, and I'd love to take whatever questions folks have at any point along the way. Great. Okay. Any questions so far? No? Okay, all right. All right, so our center actually started in 2003. It started like a lot of other centers with a lot of money that came in. In this case, it was in the post 9/11 environment. And in this case, we started in the Mailman School of Public Health, focused on a lot of public health trainings and a lot of public health preparedness. This is before my time. I came after, moved to the Earth Institute. But in general, I think the best way of sort of describing the center is really at this intersection of research, policy, and practice. So in some cases, we're conducting original research, but in all cases, we're looking at how can we make the research relevant to the problems that we have today in disaster policy and disaster practice. And we do that through a lot of different things. There are just a few examples. Maybe that's through trainings and translating that science into education. Maybe it's through policy advice. You know, some examples early on, again, before my time, this notion, after the anthrax attacks in the US, after 9/11, there was a lot of effort on anthrax preparedness. Now, there isn't a lot of good evidence on what is the proper dosage of antibiotics to an infant that's been exposed to weaponized inhalational anthrax. This is a good thing. It doesn't happen very often, if at all. Yet we were in this position where we had to help prepare healthcare systems or prepare health departments. How do you do that? And when we look at science as more descriptive, a lot of times you don't have the information until it's been observable. And it's not observable until it's affected a lot of people. Let's look at COVID-19, right? How long does immunity last from the vaccine? We can do some blood tests and look at serology, but that doesn't tell you about T cells. And T cells are an important component, but then there are other components. You see it in the data. Well, that data is people becoming reinfected, right? So we have to make policy decisions based on imperfect information. We start getting in the world of evidence-informed rather than evidence-based. In this case, for this particular problem, we did these consensus conferences. So we took a bunch of experts, put them in a room, locked the door, and told them they couldn't leave until they came up with some answers. You know, we basically asked them, okay, we don't have enough evidence, but what would you do if this happened right now? So those are the kinds of things at the edge, while building it in a way that we know it might change. Unfortunately, this is something that is probably all too real for all of us coming through the pandemic. Why is the policy guidance changing? Well, more information became available. It sounds nice in an academic lecture, it makes perfect sense, but in practice, it's much messier, right? It foments distrust. It's hard to have a nice tweet or soundbite around something that may change. Anyway, that's what we do. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the pandemic and some of the lessons from that. Then I'm going to talk about climate change and maybe make sense of it, maybe not. So, all right. I think some of the key things with the pandemic, and one of the most important things, is that it's a very uneven experience at all levels. In this case, here's some pictures globally. This picture, I like showing this because it really throws a lot of the ethics on its head. And what I mean by that is that when we talk about like vaccine availability, and don't get me wrong, I want to be very clear, there needs to be more vaccine available globally to all countries. If we're going to defeat this pandemic, if we're going to keep new variants like the Delta variant from emerging, the only way to do that is through much better distribution of vaccines. So with that in mind, you know, there's sort of the other thing you do is you try to get vaccines to the hotspots, to where there are the most cases. Well, where's the most vaccine? The US, look at the UK, you know, in some cases, so the map is sort of cleaned up a bit, but sort of what we've seen here is that some of the places with the most vaccine also has the most cases. And so this is very counterintuitive. When we talk about behavioral science in just a little bit, we'll get to why that's the case with some of this, why you can have so much vaccine in some places and not in others, and not see the infection rates line up with that. But in any case, this unevenness is going to be driven by the intervention effectiveness, vaccines, treatments, the availability of them, natural disease spread, population density, movement, and other conditions. I do want to point out, too, it's very vexing right now why so many countries, like in Africa and Southeast Asia and even Central America, seem to be having such low rates of COVID, although South America had some very high rates in Peru and elsewhere. Peru, I think, for a while, had some of the highest rates in the world. The short answer is we don't know. There could be a couple of reasons for it. One could be bad data. There was a study in Zambia, I think it was in Zambia, where some folks did some serology tests or some sort of testing of bodies in the morgue. And so the reported infection rate was somewhere around 2 or 3% for the country, but they found something like 70% among the bodies in the morgue. Now, it wasn't a definitive study, so it could be straight up that the data is wrong. It could be that there's some ecological conditions. Coronaviruses, it seems like they don't transmit as easily when it's really hot and humid, unless it's really hot and humid and then they transmit. Anyway, there could be some ecological conditions. It could be that there are some coronaviruses that just transmit normally there that provide some sort of cross immunity. You get a cold, it goes away, it happens to give you some immunity that gives you some protection. We don't know yet. It could be those, it could be something else. And then this other notion of herd immunity. And herd immunity is sort of an overused term in the US and is often used incorrectly. The idea behind herd immunity is you reach a certain threshold of people who are immune, either through vaccine or previous infection, and then somebody comes in and gets sick, there's nowhere else for it to go. It can't grab hold. There's not enough other people for it to expose. Really where we're heading with this pandemic is not herd immunity, it's suppressing spread to a manageable level. We're not going to have a clear end to this pandemic. We're going to look back and maybe say this was the time that it happened, but this pathway that we see as we're going out of it, I think that's the way that it's going to be, and I think that this is going to be a part of our life going forward. There's too many natural reservoirs for the disease. There's too many cases. It's too spread right now. The question is it at the level of severity that it is now? Does it mutate into something more mild? What kinds of vaccines do we have? What kinds of treatments do we have? But gradually suppressing it down. And it's an interesting ethical question. What level are we willing to accept? In the US, we have an average of 35 to 60,000 or so deaths from the flu every year. It's acceptable. We do vaccines. We don't wear masks in flu season. What is that point? These are a lot of the things we're confronting now. Anyway, I'm going down a rabbit hole a little bit, but I did want to talk a little bit about that because, just start you off really depressed. So, okay. I think another component, and something that was really brought to light, and I should mention too, our center is primarily domestically focused within the US. We do some international work and we connect with global audiences quite a bit, but you'll notice a lot of the things I talk about are sort of US centric because that's where I'm most comfortable talking from, but I will bring in some global examples as well and can speak to some of that. This is actually pulling data, so a blog post that some of our team did early on in the pandemic. So we didn't generate these graphics, these are pulled from other sources, but the City University of New York has been doing a tracking survey for New Yorkers throughout the pandemic, and they've had some great data. So with this question, percent of cases in blue is the percent of cases, and in gray is the percent of the population. And so you see a disproportionate impact among Black and Latinx community ethnicities. Increased households by job loss, again, similar disproportionate impact, and going from 1 week to the next, in this case week 2 to week 6, disproportionately impacting communities of color, households of color. So this traces way back into sort of structural inequities that we have. So here we have epidemiology and health science intersecting with social science and political science. In this case, here's a couple of different maps on the number of positive cases, service workers, people of color, rent-burdened households. So this is where you see who is it who has to go to work every day? Who is an essential worker who can't work from home? Who is an hourly worker who doesn't get paid if they don't go to work? Who is living in a home with multiple people living in it, with more people living in it? Who is having to take the subway and public transportation to and from work? So all of these inequalities that we have in our society before a disaster strikes, in this case a pandemic, the disasters widen those. And those who are more vulnerable before are more vulnerable after. The Sergo Foundation came up with a vulnerability in COVID-19 with an index for this. And it looks at different measures of the community: socioeconomic status, minority status and language, household and transportation, so a variety of factors. There's a couple of inequality indices as well, too. So to put it plainly, we can predict your vulnerability to a disaster with very little information about the disaster itself. We already know, based on these structural inequalities. And folks who are at higher levels of vulnerability by these measures, 23% more likely to be diagnosed, 32% more likely to die from COVID-19, almost 30% less likely to be tested, 35% more likely to be unemployed due to COVID-19. There's a story of two Americas, and in many countries of two sides to the world: those who have done well because they made the same amount of money and didn't have to commute, weren't spending that money on restaurants, and those who lost their jobs, fell behind on rent, and had trouble putting food on the table. And when we look in aggregate, we lose that, right? That gets washed out in the numbers, but when we disaggregate the numbers, we start to see that. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about, these are great colors, right? I don't know how to use these graphs other than, I can't even interpret these, but I'm going to give it a shot. So public health and economic health, this was another sort of, I would argue, a false narrative from the beginning: save the economy or save the people. So I'm going to show you three different angles of this. I should note these next three slides are all pre-Delta variant. So this is all kind of that first 6 months to a year. Okay, what do I want to talk about? So this one here, the initial lockdowns. These are all your European countries. The blue is the US, and that gray is Sweden. So what you see here is the lockdowns. Boom, economy shuts down. And this is economic activity. What is this? The various indices, the stock market indices. Boom, it tanked, right? Economy shut down. The best term I've heard is that the economy wasn't an adjustment like a recession or a depression, but it was a medically induced coma to the economies. So then look at how they bounce back up. So the US had more of a, to use a technical term, half-assed set of lockdowns. And so you see that blue line doesn't dip down as much. It doesn't hit the economy as hard. But it never really recovers because the case counts look like this. It keeps going up in the red. You see these other countries throughout Europe, they got hit harder, but they bounced back faster because the disease was suppressed. There was a window there to have economic activity in between the waves. And pandemics come in waves. Sweden never really shut down, and so it just sort of flatlined, right? So what this starts to suggest is that maybe there is a benefit. Maybe it's not a trade-off between saving lives and hitting the economy. This one I like to put in here too because this shows the importance of signals to markets. Nothing changed with the pandemic, but this was the German and French proposal on the EU Recovery Fund, and then a lot of the markets bounced up. So economies also respond to certainty and to leadership. So this was a study out of you can't even read that. That's not even, I just put that there so I didn't have blank space on the slide. This looks at factors affecting COVID-19 economic activity in Europe and sort of who got hit harder than the others. These two graphics are sort of the list of countries. One is looking at the decline in the July 2020 Commission report. And then this is actually looking at shifts. Anyway, I'm not even going to forget that that's there. The main points here are that some of the key predictors are the quality of governance, and this includes things like corruption, transparency, various components from the UN and World Bank. The structure of the economy, so basically governments that are better run, more transparent, more open, did better. Those that had really tourism-dependent economies did worse. The strictness of the lockdown measures. So this is one, if you had more strict lockdown measures, it took a bigger hit. Now, wait a minute. I just showed data that said maybe it bounced back quicker. It's not totally clear here what that effect of the lockdown measures was. This looks at it in a very specific slice of time that does show that downward trend, but doesn't show the overall health. The strictness and debt was actually observed to be not a significant factor. They thought countries with a lot of debt just couldn't pull together the resources to respond to the pandemic. But this is largely attributed to the EU Central Bank's pandemic emergency purchase program. So a lot of emergency measures that were put in place likely prevented that from being a factor. Here's another angle. 3 slides, 3 different angles. This is probably my favorite one. I'm not always a fan of these 2x2 tables because you can really like prove something without proving anything. It sort of narrows down the lens of the data, but this one is pretty good. I'll give the example on why I actually said what I just said. Someone had put together a 2x2 table and said, oh, the countries that have mask mandates or that have masks available for everyone have lower rates of COVID. Therefore, masks prevent COVID. I said, well, the countries with mask mandates are also putting more policies in place. They have more testing. There was like a whole package of things that included masks. And so that doesn't mean that masks are more effective. It just means, in this case, they are effective. But anyway, it was an oversimplification. It was someone backing into a point and doing this. Anyway, beware these graphics. But this one is really looking at different strategies. This is a zero COVID strategy. These are countries, I believe, in the G20, Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, that kind of took a we're not dealing with any COVID. There's going to be a lockdown if there is one. We're going to put in intense restrictions. They actually saw much lower negative impacts to the economy, it was much more beneficial to the economy and much lower rates of infection as a result of it. These were countries that went the opposite, exposed population and keep the economy open. For a time, a lot of the European countries are up here, and then you sort of see these in-betweens, exposed population and protected economy. I have some numbers in the notes here that I can pull, but essentially it's showing you this trend, again, pre-Delta variant. It sort of throws on its head this notion of you have to pick one or the other. I will say, I don't know what this would look like if we put all the countries in the world on here. These are some big economies. These are some economies that can absorb some shocks that other countries maybe can't. These are also ones that are not as solely dependent on tourism as others. I don't know what it would look like if we put Greece up here, or if we put China's notably missing from here, but did take a zero COVID strategy. This is all just to say these are 3 studies. We need 1,500. Like, these are very complex dynamics in terms of how economy and public health. But what it does suggest is that the relationship in a pandemic between protecting people and protecting the economy is not as simple as it's being portrayed as. It's not an either-or choice. Wow, it took a long time to walk you through that point. I apologize for that. Okay, yeah. This one here, so behavioral science. So I'd mentioned before, why is it that we have so much vaccine in countries and also extraordinarily high rates? Why is it that you have countries that don't have vaccines and we're able to keep rates so low for so long? China, North Korea, a lot of Australia, New Zealand, among others. Well, so when we look at behavioral science, there are different components. There's the threat perception at the individual level. How do we perceive? How do we receive information? Leadership. What do we mean by leadership? Individual and collective interests. Communication of science, the social context, and stress and coping. So to answer that question I just brought up, individual and collective interests. Societies that are more collective in their identity are more likely to have individuals make sacrifices for the greater good. Wear the mask, stay 6 feet apart, don't go into work, all of these things. Countries that are more individualistic, like that see individual freedom as one of those most sacred things, are far less likely to make those sacrifices for the greater good. This is a really important point because it helps to explain a lot of the differences that we're seeing here, as well as even within the United States, we see very big differences. That when individual freedom is first and foremost the most important thing, I always like to, before I became director of the center, I was deputy director, and being a deputy and being in advisory roles is the greatest job in the world. Like, nobody told me, because you present the information and you present it to, I would present it and say, look, this is the cost of doing this. But I wasn't the one who had to say, it's worth losing more lives well, that's not the kind of work we do anyway. But the point being that a society that values individual freedoms is going to tolerate more harm to the population to protect those individual freedoms. A society that protects the population is going to tolerate more challenges, more erosions of those individual freedoms in order to protect the overall health of the population. These things are obviously fundamental because in a pandemic, particularly when you don't have pharmaceutical interventions like vaccines, all you have is restrictions on people. And so what that means is that we can't look at what was done in one place and say, yeah, do the same thing over there. in countries like the US, we're not going to get as much mileage out of social distancing. You know, people ask me, well, what does that mean? One, it means we need to work a lot harder. We need to get to different leaders. It's not just Joe Biden or Donald Trump or Anthony Fauci or whoever you want. It's also community leaders. You know, who do people look for information? Sometimes it's academics, sometimes it's a doctor in a white coat, sometimes it's a pastor or a faith-based leader. We have to work a lot harder to get these messages across and to share this value. The other is that we need the drugs. The strategies for countries based on individual freedom are going to be a lot more reliant on pharmaceutical interventions. I don't know where there's a moral to this on what's right and what's wrong, and I just know what's going to work in some areas versus what's going to work in others. I'm not zooming out to some of the equity issues, right? And they're there. There are tons of them. But anyway, so here again we have behavioral science overlaying on biological science, overlaying on social science, and that's where you start to understand some of these different contexts. Oh, one thing I wanted to say, individual. So in my world with disasters, we always try to scare you into compliance, and it doesn't work so well, right? So we try more, right? Turn up the volume, and it works even less. And it actually turns out that there's a lot of, on the one hand, so scaring people doesn't work if there's no alternative. So if people feel threatened and there's a viable alternative, they're likely to modify their behavior to that more beneficial. So early on in the pandemic, when there's not a whole lot of answers and a whole lot of fear being promoted, people tend to be more defensive. They tend to lash out on these things. So again, in my field, we've been doing it wrong for decades. But you know, right next door at the behavioral science are some of the answers why. So we're working on it. Pending additional funding. Okay. All right. So opportunities in the new normal, right? So we've had this whole change to the world, remote collaboration. You know, I've heard a lot of stories like, oh, well, you know, this has shown that online learning is dead. It doesn't work for folks. And I've heard other folks say that, you know, their child or their colleague is doing better, is thriving in this environment. You know what it is? It gives us more options. It doesn't replace in person, but it also means, you know, I'm in Columbia, New York. Maybe we're not limited by the intellectual resources within a commuting distance to New York City. Maybe we can reach beyond those who have immediate access to the Metro North. Shout out to people from New York if you know the Metro North reference. Okay. E-commerce, we're looking at healthier buildings a lot more with filtration and various health screenings, things like that. Professional education. You know, this is really, and I think being here, these pictures, and there's another one not in here of, I believe it's in New Delhi, where you can see the Himalayas for the first time in generations. This is what strikes me, because this visual evidence, and actually when I talk with some of the climate scientists, they tell me that the reason the air is so clear is really just the heaviest particles have settled to the ground. These aren't the ones that persist. These aren't the ones that are going to keep in the air and keep reflecting, you know, the sunlight back in. These aren't our biggest concern, and as factories reopen, they start spewing out again, and it more than makes up for whatever was done. What I say is that for those who don't consume their information as numbers on a spreadsheet, this is some of the most powerful evidence. This is what it could look like. This is almost spiritual in terms of seeing with our own eyes the benefit of living more cleanly. And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity to capitalize on this, to really share the message in a way. It may not be the strongest evidence, but it is the strongest, it is a stronger argument for a lot of folks to be able to see it and experience it. Okay, wild cards, lots of wild cards, new variants, government interventions. Anytime, you know, again, these are very chaotic systems. Every time government intervenes to rescue an industry, there are winners and there are losers with all of this. Protectionist behaviors, vaccine nationalism, restricting exports. We saw for the first time that I'm aware of on a wide scale food insecurity being caused by something other than crop failures. In this case, we had the high potential for famine that was thankfully averted, not because there wasn't food, but because the routes. We weren't sending ships. We weren't letting people into the country. In many parts of Europe, there was fruit rotting on the trees because migrant laborers weren't allowed in. In the US, it was very economic. A lot of people were out of work. So food security was driven by not lack of food, but lack of ability to pay for food. This had so very, very widespread consequences. A lot of this driven by reducing exports because of hoarding and things like that were reducing inventories and panic buying. But there's a lot of other dynamics. I don't mean to oversimplify. Real estate. Someone asked me, I know we were having some conversations on if New York would kind of empty out. I think it's going to change. So a lot of the big companies are saying, do we really need all of this square footage? But a lot of smaller ones are saying, hey, maybe I can get in and rent that seat, and then I can have a Manhattan address. Never count New York out. But that being said, if you don't need to have everyone in these very expensive real estate markets, do you need to keep paying for that? Can you come up with new designs? So I think that's going to change a lot. Healthcare is actually one. There's a lot of patients, but a lot of costs. The kinds of procedures that are being canceled are those elective procedures which bring in the profits, which pay for and subsidize the less profitable and even loss services like psychiatric help. Other disasters, we're going to talk about climate change, consumer behaviors. Borrowing capacity, there's been a lot of money borrowed and a lot of money spent. This is a very, very expensive pandemic. And not to take anything away from the human suffering, but when we look at climate change, when we look at the type of investments needed, a lot of money's been spent. Are people going to continue to buy up debt? Are we still going to be able to finance these things? And then the other, just when you thought you were worried about it all, our adversaries are watching. So we have seen various examples. In this case, this is actually a colleague of mine who works at the George Washington University Hospital. They were in pandemic response and they had a ransomware attack. And we've seen various, the hacking of the COVID-19 vaccine data. In this case, everyone was working remotely at this Florida water plant. And it was, I think they were all using the same password. And so hackers got into that and actually started adjusting some of the chemical levels in the water that would have eventually become toxic. It would have taken a while, a few days. It wasn't something you could do quickly, but as a result of that. So I'm going to move on to climate change. You guys still with me? Any questions so far? Okay. All right. I'm going to end positive. Don't worry. Okay. So the background for all of this, and I think one of the things we've been looking at a lot is with climate change. Here's some other colorful graphics that make me look smarter than I am, but I didn't make any of them. So some of these are from Munich Re, from the reinsurance, from the UN, and from, oh no, that's next, and from, so basically this is weather-related disasters in the US, billion-dollar disasters from the US Weather Agency, NOAA, and there's more of them. We're seeing more every year, spoiler alert. This is types of disasters. It's tough to see, but the total number of disasters is increasing. So it's not just you, it doesn't just seem that way. They are actually increasing. And the other here is you see them driven a lot by hydrological events, floods, and meteorological events, storms. These are very photogenic disasters. These are very expensive. These are very acute. This is where we see a lot of the loss of life. Those aren't the ones that worry me the most. This kind of slowly upward trending red line on the bottom, drought. Drought is a chronic, long-lasting disaster, puts enormous stress on communities. Not at a level that gets a lot of attention, but it erodes the very fabric, socially, economically, of communities. Drought and heat, extreme heat events, are potentially even within our lifetime going to make large parts, significant parts, I should say, of this world uninhabitable without HVAC, without, we look at increased heat and humidity in the Sahel in Africa, in the Middle East. The types of refugee crises that we're seeing now are just a prelude to the kinds of disruptions and destabilizations that we'll see as a result of drought and increased heat and humidity. But it doesn't get all of the attention until it's at that tipping point and that acute point. But everyone I talk to in the climate world as well too says that's what keeps them up at night. If that's what keeps them up at night, it's what keeps me up at night. These are also some of the things that we see, these nation states that are on the brink of instability, starting really at that tipping point, a crop failure, a famine. There are those who have argued and those who have counter-argued that the climate change is a contributing factor to the Syrian civil war. Along the same line that it's led to crop failures, it's led to more. There's other problems with the governance in Syria. So don't worry, we're not trying to say if climate change didn't happen, there wouldn't be any problems. But as a contributing factor, I'll let you come to your own conclusions, but this is just to say that these are the kinds of things, again, this is climate science intersecting with social science, intersecting with political science. And here is actually looking at insurance rates. I'm going to skip to the next slide because the point I make with that is actually better made with this one. So more pictures I didn't make. This is from the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Agency. This is the top 10 countries and territories in terms of absolute losses from disasters from 1998 to 2017. This is the same map, only instead of absolute losses, percentage of GDP.
What's an absolute loss?
So absolute loss is the total dollar amount. This is essentially the proportion of economic output, but this is the total amount. Yeah. I'm going to drink water for dramatic effect. I was just really thirsty. Okay. This is the billion-dollar, trillion-dollar events. You see a lot of orange and red. These are your high-income or upper middle-income countries. These over here, you see a lot of greens. These are your lower-income and your middle-lower-income countries. So what the story that is really told here is this is what we see in the news, the billion-dollar weather events, the trillion-dollar events. These are the countries, much poorer countries, much smaller absolute amount in terms of disaster losses, but a much larger part of their economy. So they're going to have a harder time digging out of this, a harder time coming out. And so again, the way we look at numbers sort of biases us towards the wealthier problems, when actually this sort of cycle of falling behind after disasters, the widening of inequality, is driven a lot more by the proportion. But that's not what we're used to looking at. I'm going to move through these a little bit more. I realize it's getting later. We look at broader, this is the U.S. Centers for Disease Control has this social vulnerability index, which, similar to the Sergo Foundation I showed earlier, looks at social vulnerability. So again, like, we can predict where we'll need more help during disasters based on things like socioeconomic status, like income, like race, like access to transportation. We're actually, this I want to point out, so this is actually when we talk about sort of structural inequalities, for folks who don't know, back around the Great Depression in the 1920s, 1930s in the US, there was a practice of you'll hear talked about redlining, essentially drawing lines around areas in the community that were more attractive to investors or less attractive. Minority communities found themselves packed into redlined areas where you couldn't get a mortgage, where you couldn't get a loan to buy a home. Fast forward a century, the number of homes in areas prone to flooding, in this case of New York, is significantly higher than those that were in previously blue-lined or green-lined areas. Green-lined areas, yeah. So you see more homes in formerly red-lined areas at higher risk of disasters. There's a lot of other effects in terms of long-term economic outputs and things like that. Here we actually see, so this is the foliage on the Upper West Side, the shade cover. And here it is up in Harlem. And so again, very similarly, you see areas that are majority minority neighborhoods actually on average can be up to 12 degrees hotter as a result of different opportunity, different foliage, things like that. So here again, we see social science, we see actuarial science, we see intersecting with climate change and climate vulnerability. Okay, so we know what vulnerability is, we know what to do, right? We invest in communities, we build partnerships, we offer flexibility, we target programs, we increase representation. Great, let's do it. Here's the big question, are we ready to make sacrifices? Everyone talks a big game in the abstract. We can all agree inequality is bad. Well, I hope we can all agree. Not everyone can agree. This map I like to show off. It's of Denver, Colorado. And it's actually, I'm not trying to hate on Denver. Just the Denver Post had a good map for me to steal. But I've seen similar maps for Washington, D.C., L.A., New York, a lot of cities. So this is the hospitalizations from COVID-19, and this is the COVID-19 vaccination rates. This is the airport up here. Just ignore that. It's almost like a negative, right? Here are the areas where people are hospitalized and dying the most from COVID-19, and here's where it's the least. Yet here's where vaccinations are lowest, and here's where they're the highest. We've seen this in city after city after city. And this gets a lot into the political science. You get reelected based on how fast and how much you bring into recovery, not how equitable it is and not how much you spend on preparedness. And so what happens is these things get pushed out through the fastest available methods for reaching folks. Who has the best access to government resources? Who's in a position to take advantage of that and capitalize and to benefit from that? This is why these are self-perpetuating. A few other things I just want to point out. Here's an example here where in Houston, in a bond issue for floodplain management, included the Social Vulnerability Index, and everyone said, great, we're socially conscious, go equity. Then all of a sudden, all the money started going to the poorer side of town, where there was more social vulnerability, and a lot of folks were then saying, wait a minute, I didn't think my money was going to go there. I thought it was going to stay here. So again, it's something where we can agree in the abstract. It's a lot harder to actually get to the point where we're making sacrifices. All right, a few cross-cutting themes. We're in the home stretch, more or less, maybe not. Okay, so actually in my book, available at fine retailers and mediocre ones too. No, it was really set up to be a primer and to look at these types of disasters that are driven by human development, both in increasing the threat and the underlying vulnerability. So climate change. We are spewing out greenhouse gas emissions, and we're building in floodplains in vulnerable areas. We're sharpening the knife on both sides. Cyber threats, bio threats, including pandemics. I guess I got that one wrong. Nuclear conflict, critical infrastructure failure, all sort of areas where our activities are affecting both the threat and the vulnerability. That being said, as depressing as all this is, it also means if we're affecting this, we can reverse this. There are actions we can take to reduce the threats and reduce the vulnerabilities. Some of the things that we need more research, we need more evidence. Disasters are inherently rare events. Disaster science is a very young field. There's questions that we have, but there's a lot more that we can't answer. And I can talk all night about just kind of the need for dedicated funding frameworks. Most funding for disaster research is very episodic. So it's hard to build a cohort that builds off the last one when you don't have that stability. Meaningfully engaging communities, and this notion of our incentive structures, as I mentioned on the political science side, and really looking at how do we manage uncertainty? How do we go from determinism to embracing that? I'm gonna skip these two for now, just in the interest of time. But essentially, what this gets at is that there are a lot of measures out there for managing uncertainty. We found a lot of answers in the business sector, actually, that can be applied into the emergency management sector. Businesses all the time have to make commitments before there's enough information available to do it. This is some work we've done with public health, actually trying to look at public health metrics and how do you integrate uncertainty into that. Instead of saying, we're going to do things according to this checklist, how can you react to new information as it becomes available? I'm going to show you a quick example of a tool. This is one we did with a utility. So on the upper right-hand corner is decisions that are necessary. This was for COVID-19, different layers of interventions, different layers of protection. And then the threat information, which is very objective. What are the infection rates of the pandemic, things like that. But then the context, more political information. What measures have been put in place? What measures, this was very political, right? Are you allowed to do vaccine mandates? And then from there, so what this does is it tells you the decisions you need to make and the information you need to make it, but it doesn't tell you what decision to make. It tells you it sort of sets the table for making the decision to sort of filter out the noise. It's very different than the checklists, if this, then that. If this threshold is exceeded, then do that. This was adapted from some tools from the military. So when we talk about building resilience and we talk about this intersection, this graphic I wish was mine. It was actually, they did a literature review of all the different definitions of resilience, and that's what this real small font is. And then they mapped it out. So here you have political science, urban planning, anthropology, regional economic development. It's distributed. Everybody owns part of this. But there's no one in the middle here responsible for resilience across the board. So we kind of work in our little silos and our little fields here and come up with great discoveries and information. but then it needs to connect across these different fields. There are some groups experimenting with ways of doing this. The 100 Resilient Cities Initiative looked at this notion of a chief resilience officer, sort of this executive level within the governance structure overseeing all of it. Others are looking at new metrics to have within each branch, within each domain. After you're done reading my book, I recommend you read Daniel Aldrich's Black Wave. Daniel Aldrich has done a tremendous amount of work across the country as well as across the world. This book is about Japan's 3/11 disasters. And in a lot of the work that he does, he sort of finds this notion of social cohesion. So one of the best predictors of how people do during or after a disaster is not investments in infrastructure. It's social cohesion, how connected communities are to each other. He describes in this horizontal connections, neighbors helping neighbors, saves more lives, and has better mental health outcomes after a disaster. Vertical connections, your connection to government speeds up the recovery process. We lean on each other after a disaster, and we do better physically and mentally if we're there for each other. But the money and the resources either come through or are coordinated by government. So if you're more connected with government, you have more access to those. This completely tips on its head a lot of assumptions. Do we spend billions of dollars on seawalls, or do we invest? There's a group in San Francisco, NeighborFest, investing in block parties. This is my kind of town. The idea being that, if you're going to do a block party and there's going to be some sort of civic engagement component, that's going to pay off more for resilience, and so they'll help with permits and subsidize and things like that. I don't know if it's been rigorously tested yet, but it's based on a lot of this research. And again, changes the way we think about investments, investing in people, investing in communities, rather than investing in stuff. Okay, this is my last slide. You made it. Congratulations. So I guess I do want to end on a note of optimism that, the challenges we face seem very overwhelming at times. And yet at the same time, if they're of our creation, then it's within our abilities to reverse them. Visitations like this with the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, connecting with the global centers, connecting across Columbia through the Climate School, we also have more information at our fingertips than ever before. And it seems that every time we stretch our arms out to reach around all of a problem, a bigger one comes up, and then we have more people join in, and it may very well be that our capacity to approach these things is limitless. But I remain optimistic, not because of what I know we have in hand to address things now, but because the arc of history is always of overcoming these odds, of rising above it, of innovating through it, and I see a lot of evidence beneath the noise of a lot of the polarization that there are a lot of smart folks in this room included working towards that end. So anyway, thank you for your time. Thank you for spending time while you're in the middle of Paris at an academic lecture. And if folks have questions, I'd be more than happy to answer any of them. So thank you. Oh, I have two. Okay.
I guess my question is simple, but I've always wondered throughout the pandemic of COVID-19 why the world was so little prepared.
Yeah.
Knowing that there was a film called Contagion that came out in 2011, describing exactly what we're living now, only if it was maybe SARS, or knowing that many people, including Obama, including I think Steve Jobs or other people were. And so I imagine that the scientific community knew even more about the very realistic possibility of this pandemic. So why is it that when it happened, the response seemed like something like completely like that erupted out of nowhere? France starts saying that, for instance, we shouldn't wear masks because we didn't have masks, and that masks were not necessarily important, and then 3 months later they changed their mind where they got masks. I mean, there were things that seemed evident as a response, and we don't know. I mean, there's
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I don't have an answer, but I can make you angrier about it. So there were SARS-1 in 2003, they modeled the number of N95 masks and ventilators that would be needed. And there were multiple reports globally and domestically within the US basically saying, we're not going to have enough masks. No way we're going to have enough masks. They looked at the burn rates at one of the hospitals and said, we don't have anywhere near the manufacturing capacity to do this. In H1N1 in 2009, same analyses were done. Don't have enough personal protective equipment, don't have enough ventilators, don't have enough capacity for doing this. There have been some moves, more on the pharmaceutical side, that I think we're seeing pay off with some of the vaccines. I don't know why. The data was there. The only answer I can come up with is sometimes science isn't enough. It needs to be part of the lived experience. And that's the other thing. You know, the Global Health Security Index ranked the United States as the most prepared in the world for a pandemic. Number one. I got data to support that. And when asked about that, I know the answer is often that we couldn't have seen the Trump administration coming. Again, using a technical term, I can't help but call bullshit on that, because there was a fairly lengthy campaign. But even forgetting about Trump himself and forgetting about the politics of the moment, we have literally seen this in prior pandemics. In 1918, you had the anti-mask leagues. You had enormous pushback, and in smaller or other more localized pandemics since then. This overlay of the political science was either ignored or not properly fused into some of these indices. I'm very wary of indices of one number that tells you how prepared you are, because two things go wrong. One is you end up washing out a lot of inequality in the way you level out your data, and the other is, it's like in Jurassic Park when they had the DNA of the dinosaurs and they had gaps in it, and so they put in the frog DNA. You guys seen Jurassic Park? Anyway, the dinosaurs start breeding, and then they get out there, and then you get like 4 more movies or 5 more movies, and then they're still making them. Anyway, this isn't about Jurassic Park. But I think what it is that we hunger for certainty, and we live in a world that's mired in uncertainty. And so we sort of create proxies for that. Well, I haven't experienced this in a while. And there is a linkage with that. You know, there's no one in living memory who was a part of a pandemic like this before. The data was there, but we didn't take the action that was necessary. So I think we need to look beyond science, or at least beyond the science we've been relying on to help tell that story. But it's a mystery to me. I wish I had a better answer, because there was very little in this pandemic that did not play out the way one would have expected it to if they were following the trajectory of pandemics and the level of preparedness. I would say the one thing I was shocked about is just the sheer level of political polarization. I don't think I quite expected that. I expected some, but not to that level, yeah. Did you have a question? And then go ahead.
It's almost a follow-up. You said that scaring people doesn't work.
Yeah.
So I'd like to know what you consider would be the best options, particularly in a context where you have massive pushbacks,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly when the crisis has already started, kind of like now or 2 months ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
Other than, is it just nudging, or are there other options to explore?
Yeah, so a lot of it is context dependent, but as a general sort of oversimplified answer, I'd say empowerment. So in general, looking at the individual level, is that when people feel empowered to sort of take care of their own destiny, if there's something that they can do to take care of themselves, then they're more likely to do that. Then they're more likely to be as stressed out with that. The other would be the engagement with community leaders. So 2 very quick examples. We were in Arkansas, and a state policeman we were talking to was talking about they had a new system where you can register for emergency alerts. And a lot of the immigrant community would come to the meetings and they'd say, oh yeah, that sounds great, yeah. And then they'd go back to their community and they'd talk to their pastor and say, should we do this, or is this for real, or is this something we're going to be? So it wasn't the officer that was the most important node of communication, it was the faith-based leader, it was the pastor. Another was in Hurricane Sandy. There was a group that didn't evacuate, and it was a sort of the other side where there was a pastor that actually was telling his folks that, now just pray. You're good. Just pray. You don't have to evacuate. And when I heard this and when I heard it was being presented, it's not that story that struck me, it's the way the person presenting it explained it, that instead of saying, oh, that's awful, we got to arrest these people or something, it was, we need to figure out how to better engage them before a disaster, because people listen to them instead of us, and we need to find a way to engage them in preparedness, which is more expensive and more time consuming. So that's why we don't do the kinds of investments in preparedness, but those are the engagement strategies I'd recommend, just on a quick answer. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Do you have?
Can I ask you to talk a little bit more about looking beyond science in a couple of ways? One, Lamia's question, the first example she offered was a film, right?
Yeah.
Contagion, as we had information there, right? Your response was to go to Jurassic Park and then talk about the 5 films that came after it. That we have the
franchise. Sorry. Go
we have the information there, right? So there's nobody living from the 1918 right flu pandemic, but there is an entire world of living literature, art,
Yeah.
music, right? All of these other locations where the kind of information that we need, for those of us immersed in it, who knew immediately, this is a mask I sewed in my apartment on my sewing machine upstairs in the first weeks of the pandemic, and it's one of the 4 or 5 or 6 that I made that got me through, right? With all the other things that we did, but it got us through in some sense. So I'm wondering where. You talked about it has to be kind of daily habit. That wasn't the word you used. It was daily life, part of daily life in some ways, in terms of preparedness. And I'm trying to think of where in the kind of scheme, the overviews you've given us, things like culture, things like practice, things like the social persist. Because even when you were looking for alternative places of leadership, it was like religious leadership as opposed to the hip hop world, or the places that we might not want to think of as being influential in terms of questions of science and questions of world practice, but in fact are neighbors in certain kinds of ways in our contemporary sphere.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm thinking of the humanities as a repository of the knowledge, in some sense, as the repository of the knowledge from prior experience that doesn't actually fit into any of the schemes on the screen that you've shown us.
That's a great point, and I'm really glad you bring that up. It's missing, and it's a problem that it's missing because it's a huge influence that's not accounted for in there. And I should say, actually, I was on a call earlier today with a group on performing arts preparedness. And I was on a call a few weeks before with a playwright who's focused on climate change and doing a lot of climate change. A lot of this actually stemmed from an interview where I talked a little bit about my background in theater, and then it got on the radar of the development team at the university. And anyway, a whole cascading set of events, and it turns out that there's a lot of, and being here with all of you and seeing the work that you're doing and just very, very short snippets, getting a sense of these things. I think the short answer is that it's the next frontier in disaster science and disaster management, because the arts are such a huge part of how we consume information, on how we contextualize the world around us, and how we bridge the physical with the metaphysical. I think back, actually, my dad once told me, as I was getting into some of these books he had from Bertrand Russell and others on science and religion, that science is set up to understand what is knowable, but those are the limits of it. And that's why you have other fields for how do you get beyond the boundaries of what's knowable. And what I take from that is that our understanding of the world around us, if it's exclusively rooted in the sciences, is going to be limited from the total picture. Some of the more impressive things that I've seen with climate change is there was a group that put signs up on trees at like 6-foot marks around. And what this exhibit was about is this is the water level in 150 years. All of a sudden you can visualize it, you could experience it. I mean, you've already tagged me as one who uses movie quotes. You haven't even heard me dig into my Simpsons quote library. So, yeah, my mom's shaking her head here. She's right up front. Yeah, right. But it is like that's the analogy. That's how we understand things as we look at it and the experiences of others. I know about the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression from The Grapes of Wrath. I know about Richard III from Shakespeare's interpretation. And then, come to find out he may have not been that bad of a guy as Shakespeare wrote him out to be. And I'm like, that can't be true. Why would he have written the play? Anyway, I'm sorry I'm giving sort of a roundabout, long-winded answer, but it's probably also just an acknowledgement that it's a big flaw. There's a lot of interest, I will say. It comes up a lot in the rhetoric that is kind of the next thing that we need to engage the arts. We just haven't gotten past the conversation of acknowledging we need to do it to actually figuring out how do we operationalize that, how do we resource that, how do we really blow the doors open. I'm 100% open to working with anyone here and sort of trying to figure that out as well too, because I think that's a very important frontier. And we're never going to get the information out of these books in ways that are meaningful towards preventing the next pandemic or preventing the next disaster. And we either have to wait until enough people die from it, that people will stop turning their heads to it, or reach them in a more spiritual way. I'd like to try to do the latter rather than just wait on the former. Yeah. I always like walking by your office because there's always great music playing.
That's
Yeah,
good news.
yeah. Which I don't want to creep. I realize that may have sounded creepy. Let me find a better way to say what I
Next
just
door,
said.
next time you can knock on the door and just come in.
Yeah. Okay.
Rather than just going back and forth.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just like. Okay. Yeah, that is.
No,
I think
wanted
it's creepier. You
I
knew
wanted
that,
to ask you a question regarding this specific moment in history where we at. There's people like you, scientists, who study these things, and there's like people like me, for example, who know nothing about this, but we go onto social media and say, no, Jeff was speaking for 2 hours about this. I think he's wrong. You know what I mean? Like right now is ignorance versus science.
Yeah.
And ignorance seems to be winning this conversation. My question is towards you guys, the people on the scientific spectrum of the world, how are you thinking about communicating this in a more effective way in order to like incorporate or try to incorporate everybody so the pasture doesn't go, the flood's coming, the tsunami's coming, let's just pray instead of running, you know?
Yeah.
So on your end, how you're preparing this?
Yeah, and I think that this is where we sort of diverge from the center and the climate school from sort of traditional scientific inquiry, which is, you know, in building a field of science, you do experiments, you write them up, you publish them, you get them peer reviewed, you submit them to a tenure committee. You know, that's the career track. And I'm not throwing shade at that. It's important to do boundary expanding science. But you kind of leave it for the rest of the world. One of my favorite conversations with someone in computer science is he said, we only have to prove it works once, then because we prove it's possible. It's up to industry to figure out how to do something with it. So a lot of the work that we've been doing, which I didn't go as much into here, a lot of the community coalition building and a lot of the advisory roles. So we've done some work on children in disasters, working with communities. And it's a delicate thing. You know, where does academia end and the real world begin? So what we've done in the project, in this case, the Resilient Children, Resilient Communities Initiative, is actually work with community partners. We have some frameworks for kind of analyzing and measuring resilience related to children in disasters. And it breaks it apart into different sectors, into different groups we can bring together. And we lay out all these different measures. But the way we approach it from there is instead of prescribing a solution, we present the information of the community and we say, where do you want to start? And there's so much work to do, it doesn't really matter if they say we want to start. Some want to start with childcare because childcare is where they're already leveraged and have it. Others may want to start with schools or emergency management. But it becomes community-led. So we provide the information. We sit down with them one-on-one. We work to help craft things. So we sort of work with folks within the community. I like to say we lay out a buffet, but they decide where they want to eat. I don't know if that's the answer for everything, but we have had very significant measures of improvement quantifiably. What we haven't, this project was happening during the pandemic and we had to change everything. And we talked to the communities and we said, do you want to keep having these meetings? They said yes. That it was the social connections that became very valuable. All of a sudden, emergency management knew the child-serving infrastructure in a community. We were on phone calls, and they'd be saying, oh, we need volunteers for this, and then another group said, I have some, I'm sending you some information right now. There was a diaper bank making arrangements to get diapers to shelters, or to families, to the food bank where they needed diapers and some of the packages for people who couldn't afford food to also make sure that they had diapers for their kids. Anyway, these are just examples of things that came from the social networks that we actually didn't really measure. that came as a result of it. So what I'm about to propose, what I think that means to answer your question, is the science needs to get out of the lab and into the community, and it needs to be in partnership with the community. And I hesitate in saying that, because as exciting of a proposition as that is, it's a very dangerous one. There's a great article co-authored by a colleague of mine, Lori Peak, at the Natural Hazard Center, that actually talks about needing a code of ethics in disasters. You are inherently dealing with a very vulnerable population. And while a lot of the folks that I work with, I have the utmost respect for taking the utmost respect for communities, you can very much get trapped in a mindset of, I need my data. I'll give one quick example. I helped a researcher get connected with a group we were working with after a disaster because they couldn't get access to shelter information and had some funding from the National Science Foundation, and we helped them get connected. And the person then said, I'd love to have some of this data for my board so that they know the reach that we have. And the researcher said, we should have a publication out in 6 to 9 months, and you should have access to it then. Now, they eventually worked it out, so they were able to get some of the data, but in the world of research, there was absolutely nothing wrong with that response. It's your data, and you can't put it out there until it's embargoed, until it gets released, and there's a process for these things, but it can have an impact now. So the science needs to get out of the lab, it needs to partner with communities, but this is, I glossed through it in an earlier slide, but we need to genuinely connect with communities. And like many things, it costs more money and it takes more time, but it's the only way to do it. So I don't know if I sort of at least half answered the question, but I think it's, we can't do it within our field alone. Please.
I'm not as optimistic as you are. I want to raise one question,
Please.
Which is valid for both the pandemic and the climate change, is the idea of collective. I mean, there's one thing that this pandemic put light on is the fact that different countries have different policies. And yes, you might have the resilience of a community for natural disasters that happens in one country or an explosion that happened in one country, and then the communities are going to help a lot to continue and to get back to life. But what about a pandemic where you have someone in Brazil who has crazy idea about how to deal with COVID, and then unless you have a global way of addressing it with rules and regulation in the same way that you might address weapons or different or wars or regulations, we're never gonna have a common we're never gonna have a way out to address climate change or the pandemic because massive big countries can deal with it in a totally different way, and we are all connected in ways we were not in 1917.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think that's a great question. It's one that I get a lot too, just in terms of global systems. Do we need stronger global governance? And I have a hard time. This is basically my answer to every question is I don't know, and then I'm going to talk about it for a few minutes. But what I would say is that, you can't have meaningful global readiness without meaningful community integration, because community preparedness accumulates into national and global. At the same time, a pandemic, a flood, climate change. I work with a lot of communities on their climate mitigation plans, climate mitigation and adaptation. They say we need to be carbon neutral by 2050 or by 2030. We need to be zero emissions. I'm like, that's great. But that's not going to do anything to prevent the disasters that are confronting your community if you're the only ones doing it. So we need everyone to do it, but then you also need to prepare for what's coming. I guess the challenge I have with a lot of the global systems we currently have, and there have been steps through the World Health Organization with things like the international health regulations, they're a mixed bag because these organizations are inherently a mosaic of nation states that are advocating for their own self-interest, and there are a lot of biases integrated into them. They've made for good forums for talking about things, for bringing things up. They've created whole new dynamics to negotiation and international relations. I think the jury is still out on if it's a net positive effect or if it perpetuates a lot of inequalities. Folks may disagree, and honestly, this isn't my field, so I probably shouldn't even be saying these things. But I guess, I think we do need stronger guideposts globally, but also recognize that community resilience starts at the community. I've been in a bunch of meetings with a lot of global actors. My favorite was in Puerto Rico, and I was in this conference room full of different NGOs that were doing work in Puerto Rico, and they were talking about how can we get communities to better integrate with us. I was like, wait, what was that question? How can we better get communities? Only one person in the room was from Puerto Rico, and that was the representative from Oxfam, who just happened to send the person who was in Puerto Rico. I was like, go outside. Like, here's a whole island that's recovering, and all the people in the room talking about the policy don't represent the community. And I've been in room after room after room of folks who are like, yeah, how do we get communities to work with us? Like, how do you work better with communities? Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm trailing off. The short answer is I don't have an answer to this. I think there's a lot of folks working towards this. Oh, there is one example, actually. The Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, is an interesting model that I've seen also domestically within the US with a group called Healthcare Ready. Now, they're very specific to one type of problem. But what it is it's basically a nonprofit, and it was started with funding from the Japanese government, the Norwegian governments, and then a few others came into play. And what they were going to do is they had been focused on developing vaccine technology for vaccines with for diseases with high pandemic potential, but with low market incentives for investing in them. So flu was one. We're very worried about flu pandemics, but there's a market for flu vaccines. There's people researching that. So they were looking at a variety, and I believe coronaviruses was one of them. They were formed just a few years before the pandemic. They've actually, behind the scenes, been very instrumental in terms of sharing the intellectual property across the pharmaceutical industry, of getting things into like the Serum Institute in India and elsewhere, and serving as a bridge between the private sector, where a lot of the capacity and R&D is, with the public sector, where a lot of the need is and where a lot of the market incentives are less intense in terms of pressuring things. So I think there is an answer. I think we just haven't thought of it yet. I guess that's how I'll end, hopeful. Yeah. One.
It's a sort of tiny question, comment. So I have a dog who is 2 now. The first set of annual vaccines, like I hadn't paid attention, but when I vaccinated her in May, and I looked at the sticker, one of the 3 vaccines that they take is the coronavirus vaccine. And so when I told the vet, like, is this really coronavirus? He said, well, yes, it's been, in animals for a very long time, and we've vaccinated. Is that like the same? Is it technically the same thing? And if so, was there never, it goes back to Lemia's question also about preparedness.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The short answer is I don't know, like all of the other ones. Now let me talk about it. So I don't know. I know that pharmaceuticals for animals are under less stringent requirements than for people. They're still stringent, but less stringent. The types of viruses, the types of things that they're looking at. From what I understand, coronavirus vaccines had been in the works previously. I guess the question would be also, is there cross immunity with COVID, or is the mutation too significant? Like, how does it actually target? This is the interesting thing with the messenger RNA vaccines that seems so effective, is they're targeting a region on the virus that doesn't mutate very much. And it may actually provide better immunity than infection, because when you get infected, it's sort of wild card where the immunity develops, what piece it's looking at. And it could be targeted towards a part of the virus that mutates more frequently. I know there are a lot of things, like there's anthrax vaccines that's done more routinely, and livestock and things like that. I have a friend who's a veterinarian who would probably know a lot more about that. But yeah, the short answer is I don't know. I know there are a lot of variables. Sometimes animal models can be useful for human vaccines. Actually, that was what accelerated AstraZeneca so quickly in their vaccine development, as they were able to infect monkeys with coronavirus and test it. So actually, it's called a challenge study. But with canines and with the coronavirus, I just don't know enough. I'll see if I can get an answer though. Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you guys. Thank you.